Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Van Gogh's Fragmented Self, the active melancholy of an artist. If you now can forgive a man for going more deeply into paintings, admit also that the love of books is as holy as that of Rembrandt, and I even think that the two complement each other. Van Gogh in a letter to his brother Theo, June 1880. Hi everybody, you'll be glad to see I've got both ears still. The idea behind today's talk was, as you can see, I've started with a quote from a letter Van Gogh sent to his brother Theo, and he was as quite many people of the time, he was a prolific letter writer. So in those halcyon days before email, before constant social media, people actually wrote thoughtful letters to each other, and his brother helped support him, and periodically he spent his time travelling away from his family, as we'll discuss as we go through. But I like this particular quote, and what I wanted to do was I think every single quote from Van Gogh in this talk is from June 1880, the letter to his brother Theo. And in many of his other letters, he discusses specific works of art. But what I wanted to do was just give an overview of one particular letter in which he discusses his ideas of art in quite a bit of detail. So I'll be using specific Van Gogh paintings to illustrate his general points, but just to emphasize, this is quite a general letter. He doesn't talk about specific paintings. So that's what I'm adding, is my personal choice of illustrative paintings, which hopefully will still make sense. And a major theme of this channel is the idea that the combination of books, reading, and visual art. And it was just reading this, it reminded me of the channel's main motivation. And it's just quite reassuring to see Van Gogh is basically backing me up. So if you disagree with me, have it out with Vincent, who's a greater artist or, creative than I could ever hope to be, and, rightly deserves to be classed as one of the most important painters there's been. But anyway, so if you can keep this quotation in mind throughout the talk, and I'll start off with just a couple of images before I start quoting from this letter of June 1880. So I hope to show you some paintings that you won't have seen from Van Gogh, a bit off the beaten track, so to speak. But this is, given his love of books, it's quite interesting. There's the token still life rose on the right-hand side, but his actual portrayal of a pile of books, which he loved enough to want to represent, which in this illiterate day and age is very, like I said, reassuring that Van Gogh had this lifelong passion. And there's just a beautiful range, well, I was going to say limited range of colour. He's obviously emphasising the pastel shades, the russet red, I think you might call it, the orangey, but the actual table full of books, at least colour-wise, is complemented by the quite odd background. I don't know, on there, is it wallpaper? But anyway, that's the title, French Novels and Rose, from approximately 1888. And then more significantly, perhaps, is this painting. And if you can have a good look at it, I will be referring back to it during the talk, because one of the themes of the talk is the role that birds play in Van Gogh's mind. And normally I don't show paintings complete with frame, but when I was looking for a copy of this particular painting, it was very difficult to get accurate tone. And this is just an ongoing problem when you try and find online representations of various paintings. I've said to you before, but if you try and do it yourself, you'll see there's quite a range of different hues and colours for the same painting. So if at all possible, it would be absolutely ideal if you could watch these videos. I have a system whereby I can do it through my TV screen. If you've got a similar setup, you can reroute YouTube through a good quality TV screen. You can see a whole other realm, because I get the sense, at least my laptop, the resolution's pretty poor compared to a good TV. But in this particular painting, for example, the colour, you can see the path, the sandy path that leads to the tower. I think it's the tower in a cemetery. And I believe he painted, I've seen quite a few, was it as many as 11? But he did quite a few of this tower. And not long after he completed them, the tower was knocked down. And I believe in one of his other letters, not the one from June 1880, he refers to the idea that the farmers in the area would be buried in the same land that they tilled. But anyway, I was referring to the colour of the path that leads up. And in some representations, that's almost like a bloody red. Whereas in this one, you actually see it's much more sandy. So it's quite... Ironically, if you find a representation or a print of this painting in which it looks more red, you've got the added dimension inadvertently of almost like the ground is giving forth blood, which is quite macabre. But this is the most accurate I could find, and in terms of tone and hue. But there's almost a way in which the birds are replicated in the crucifixes, the gravestone crucifixes. And then if you notice, there's obviously birds to the right of the tower, but on the very top of the steeple, I don't think that's a stretch to suggest that that is a bird perched on top. Because otherwise it just wouldn't be an accurate crucifix on the top of the tower. But I just think this is a beautiful painting that conveys Van Gogh's idea, a theme that we see in many of his letters. There's an implicit loneliness, there's an implicit isolation to the tower. I'll show you other examples of the melancholy I referred to. The birds as well, as we shortly see. Van Gogh, associated it with self-imposed exile. And this isn't the most melancholic. The lighting is, not particularly depressing. It's just, what I quite like about this isn't the relatively bright background light, in a way, emphasizes the solitude of the tower. It doesn't merge into its surroundings. It stands there alone. And you've got what looks like a peasant woman in the foreground that almost duplicates that effect. And then the other, inverted commas, figures, which are the gravestones, the crucifixes at the graveside. And like I say, I obviously can't show all of... He was a voluminous painter. very prolific, so I can't show all, but I'd encourage you to go. And obviously, depending on response to this video, I aim to do quite a few more on Van Gogh eventually. It's well worth checking out some of the others he did along this line. So I mentioned the concept of birds in Van Gogh. So he has this notion, there's two elements. One is the idea of the way they molt, the way that birds go, they renew their plumage, which he uses as a metaphor for when you need to get away from it all. And obviously, he ended his own life. He spent his whole life, adult life, was he suffered mental illness. So that's one aspect, and then later on we'll also see he had the notion of a caged bird, the lack of freedom of a bird. So back to that previous, the cemetery tower. The birds were at least free there, but there's the connotation, they almost duplicate or mirror the crucifixes that in that particular context are obviously associated with death. So there's lots of, symbolism going on. I'm inclined to believe it is beneficial and the best and most reasonable position to take for me to go away and to remain at a proper distance, as if I didn't exist. What molting is to birds, the time when they change their feathers, that's adversity or misfortune, hard times for us human beings. One may remain in this period of molting. One may also come out of it renewed. But it's not to be done in public, however. It's scarcely entertaining. It's not cheerful. So it's a matter of making oneself scarce. Well, so be it. And that's... like I said, all the subsequent quotations will be from the same letter to Theo. I've mixed the order of the quotations slightly. So just be aware if you go and source it yourself and have a read. I've slightly altered the excerpts, the order they come in. But I just find this an interesting quote, the idea, for a number of reasons. So I've described the symbolism of how he's using birds as an image, but this notion of renewal. And then as I was thinking, it struck me that what Van Gogh is advocating is the periodic need for people to get away from it all. And if you think of how that is the direct opposite of what tends to happen today, and I know I bang on about the evils of social media, but I'm just throwing out the notion that if this is what Van Gogh is saying as a highly creative, deeply artistic person, the extent to which this isn't possible or this isn't practiced, generally in today's world. So to what extent do people have or allow themselves to have or are allowed by society to have this period of what Van Gogh compares to molting? One may also come out of it renewed. Well, I would suggest a contributing factor at least to a lot of mental illness is the lack of opportunities for mental renewal. But it's not to be done in public, he says. Yeah, if you think of reality television, if you think of the excessive transparency of social media, everything is now done in public. However, it's scarcely entertaining. Again, reality television, everything on social media, TikTok, Instagram, all this constant need for entertaining images. It's not cheerful. Well, again, there's this cultural pressure for everything to be happy, clappy and light-hearted. So it's a matter of making oneself scarce. Again, that's the exact opposite. Everybody makes everything public these days. Well, so be it, he says. Well, anyways, onto the idea, again, remember these comments and this metaphor of the bird, and I just thought it'd be interesting to illustrate it with a couple of relevant images. So as far as I know, this isn't one of his more popular paintings. And why I wanted to show you that, I'm not claiming it's a particularly brilliant painting and it's, the finest Van Gogh ever did. But what is interesting is once you know some of his inner thoughts about birds, this made me think of the advantages or what reading more contextual information about artists, whether that's from their own mouths in their diaries or letters, or a major rationale of the channel is to look at philosophical works or pieces of literature that can be related to art. Van Gogh's words about birds just makes me then, once I was aware of them and read them, then when you look at a painting like this, it makes you think of the painting in, I think, a deeper way than if you weren't aware of what he'd said. A similar example I can think of is, and I'm sorry if it sounds slightly tangential, but I was reading a biography of Samuel Beckett, and it referred to where he grew up in quite a middle-class home in Ireland. There were larch trees, and in Waiting for Godot, and I think his novel Malloy, there's references that in Waiting for Godot, the stage instructions are a single tree, which I believe is a larch tree. And in Malloy, apologies if I've misremembered the novel, but there's a reference to larch trees, and in and of themselves, that's not particularly important, but there's just a certain resonance when you know that it was part of his childhood, and then you see this represented in one of his plays. I personally am not normally one that puts a lot of stock by autobiographical information. Works of art should stand or fall on their own merits, but I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if you can learn certain things about artists, you get a hint of how some of their influences were quite arbitrary or contingent. Yet it's interesting to see how they feed into the art. And you can't, once you've read the letter to Theo about birds, you can't unthink that when you see a painting like this. So maybe some people would see that as a disadvantage. You're just confusing the issue. Why don't you just look at the bloody bird, Paul? But I do think having that extra information in the back of your head just adds another layer of interest to it. And just from a technical point of view, it's beautiful the way he's replicated, or I keep using the phrase replicated or mirrored, but in this case it's true. The green of the grass or the reeds, how they're reflected in the kingfisher. And then my previous spiel about, once you know some background information, paintings can be more interesting. I think it applies to this because left to my own devices, I don't think I would have particularly appreciated or thought anything of this. But once you've got the notion of the significance of birds and molting and birds in cages, which I'll describe in a second, that Van Gogh wrote about, it then takes on a bit more significance. Because obviously it's a highly domesticated bird, it's not a natural branch, it's a manufactured stump that the bird is resting upon. And I can't see whether it's tied or it's obviously got limited ability to fly anywhere it wants to. So if not directly caged, it's caged in a sense. And then I believe this has long been known, I think, as Wheatfield with a lark, and apparently there's some big ornithological debate, and it's been recently argued that it's a partridge. Well, irrespective, lark or partridge, I just think, again, the notion of, or when I say again, I'm going to talk in a second a bit more about Van Gogh's notion of exile, self-exile and loneliness. And this, once again, once you're aware of that in his letter, you've previously seen the idea, he says that it's better for him to stay away. He's talking about the need to have distance from his family. And that begs the question, subconsciously or even more directly, would that be a factor in his portrayal of this bird alone with the, the vastness of the sky behind? And yet again, this theme of replication, the way in which the bird, the form of the bird, isn't a million miles away from the form of the wheat ears below it. And because I do have a genuinely macabre mind, I'm thinking it works slightly better as a partridge because they're a game bird, so at any point that poor bird could be about to be shot, whereas a lark, I think, would be a bit more protected even in those times. And here's another excerpt from the same letter. I, for one, am a man of passions, capable of and liable to do rather foolish things, for which I sometimes feel rather sorry. Now, that being so, what's to be done? Must one consider oneself a dangerous man, incapable of anything at all? I don't think so, but it's a matter of trying by every means to turn even these passions to good account. For example, to name one passion among others, I have a more or less irresistible passion for books, and I have a need continually to educate myself, to study, if you like, precisely as I need to eat my bread. You'll be able to understand that yourself. When I was in different surroundings, in surroundings of paintings and works of art, you well know that I then took a violent passion for those surroundings that went as far as enthusiasm. And I don't repent it, and now, far from the country again, I often feel homesick for the country of paintings. And I'm obviously going to find that interesting because of this phrase, I have a more or less irresistible passion for books, to the extent that he needs them precisely as I need to eat my bread. The bread of life. Books are like manna for Van Gogh. But also in this section, the idea that I think there's an underlying thing, well, not even underlying, it's on the surface, the concept of passion. So it's this dilemma in Van Gogh's life that his passion comes through. And I've shown you paintings that aren't as passionate as his later stuff, as his mental illness got worse and worse. So there's the cliche of the tortured artist, but there's always been this close association with artists on the edge of sanity. And the more disturbed, the more on the edge, but hugely profound and emotionally stimulating and sometimes even upsetting their work can be. So Nietzsche would be another person who was, seriously mentally ill towards the end, and it gives a fevered, slightly deranged quality to some of his writing. But, when it's just this side of madness, he's able to say things most philosophers would just be unable to. But it's the terrible price to be paid of complete mental illness. I just think it's a beautiful phrase, homesick for the country of paintings, which could be seen as homesick for any environment in which art is available directly as a nurturing resource. And again, if you want to think of what he's saying in the context of today's world, where what Van Gogh is valuing and what he finds to be passionately the basis of his life is just increasingly extinct. You know, there aren't many people now who need to read precisely as I need to eat my bread as they waddle off to McDonald's. But just by the by, this was one of his paintings on the subject of reading. And even though I don't think the brushwork is typical, you know, later Van Gogh that people would recognise, the use of colour, the intensity, I'm not sure you could say it's uniquely Van Gogh, but it does add a layer of recognisability to it. And it's the way in which the intense concentration of the reader resonates with the intensity of the colour. There's this numinous. The environment seems to match or highlight her state of mind. Again from the same letter, June 1880. If now you can forgive a man for going more deeply into paintings, admit also that the love of books is as holy as that of Rembrandt, and I even think that the two complement each other. So that's one of the opening quotations I used. But it continues soon after. To put it no higher, my God, how beautiful that is. Shakespeare, who is as mysterious as he? His language and his way of doing things are surely the equal of any brush trembling with fever and emotion. But one has to learn to read as one has to learn to see and learn to live. So I've picked this out because everything I'm emphasising in italicized and emboldened print there, it chimes with the previous video about Sartre, and I used an illustration for one of Sartre's passages from Edvard Munch's painting called Angst. So what I was suggesting in that video was Munch is providing a visual portrayal of, with his brushstrokes, of the same type of thing. Some of the phrases Sartre uses are disintegration of reality and flow. And you can see it in a Munch painting, whether it's The Scream or whether it's Angst or many of his paintings. The sky seems to be dissolving in these intense red colour, and people as forms seem to be melting away, almost disintegrating. And it's just reassuring to see Van Gogh here, you know, such a gifted artist, not privileging pure visuality. He's recognising the crucial importance of the supplementary feature of reading. And not just reading, learning to read. In other words, reading properly, putting yourself, you know, a bit of oomph into it. Just like one has, so, you know, it sounds counterintuitive, one has to learn to see. Of course, in a way you don't. Seeing for anyone with normal eyesight is perfectly natural. But at the same time, there are ways of seeing. It's a famous book by John Berger, or Berger, is it? Ways of Seeing. And then there's the open question as the relationship between learning to see, in other words, art, visual art, learning to read, literature and how they may contribute to learning how to live. Which again, it's an open question for today's social media saturated world. How are we living when the majority of the population don't learn to see and don't learn to read in the way that Van Gogh is describing? But again, I'm selfishly showing you these pictures because I'm just chuffed with the way Van Gogh decides to turn the subject of a still life on the topic of books. You know, the vast majority of artists wouldn't see it as particularly worthwhile, but Van Gogh did. And it's almost the contrast, the inertness, the static nature of books, and yet the contrast with the way he previously described it in the quote, they help you to learn to live in a way. So it's almost like a painting about potential that lies within a completely inert object. So the still life, I think, is a relatively arch description. They're the stillest of things books, but actually the most evocative and the most dynamic in a cerebral sense also. And then I want to talk about this concept of active melancholy. So some of the images I'm going to show you, and it's an interesting. A lot of later Van Gogh paintings that they do use some dark, intense colours, but most often there's almost like an overpowering brightness to some of his paintings, yet simultaneously he creates a melancholic atmosphere. So it's vaguely. So I'm not trying to compare them; they're vastly different artists, but Giorgio de Chirico achieves melancholic effects through excess brightness, sunlight that somehow manages to be miserable the way he depicts it. But I'm going to show you in a second some pictures by Van Gogh that are autumnal and therefore almost automatically melancholic. But in some senses, I may have said it before, but I am much more comfortable in autumn, winter time than summertime. I find like autumn sunsets, winter sunsets, much more beautiful than summer. But that simultaneously, there's a melancholic edge. You know, nature's dying to be renewed, like the molting bird in Future. And it's just also reassuring. I'm not, I don't need to be sectioned. There were people like, I think I've mentioned before, Manet, was Manet and Monet potentially, but definitely Monet, I think, talked about the excessive brightness, trying to paint in excessively bright conditions, which he didn't like. He found it quite oppressive. And so I'm just asking you to think of the nature of melancholy, how productive it can be in an artistic way, and also the way it can be achieved simultaneously, both in brightness and in subdued light. But just to give you more specifics. Now I no longer have those surroundings, however. That's something that's called soul. They claim that it never dies and that it lives forever and seeks forever and forever and forevermore, which sounds like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, doesn't it? Which I'm just wondering whether that was, I haven't looked that up, whether it's a direct reference to that. So instead of succumbing to homesickness, I said to myself, One's country or native land is everywhere. So instead of giving way to despair, I took the way of active melancholy, as long as I had strength for activity. Or in other words, I preferred the melancholy that hopes and aspires and searches to the one that despairs, mournful and stagnant. So what I found interesting about this is his Van Gogh's distinction between the melancholy that hopes and aspires and searches, and he contrasts that with the one that despairs, mournful and stagnant. So I want to give props to Vincent for the way in which he's promoting a positive form of melancholy, which I've always believed has a role, and again, in a modern society that doesn't know how to deal with melancholy, there's this forced jollity, there's this forced happy-clappy cultural environment, which I honestly believe set some people off, because it's the cliche about social media creating unrealistic expectations. You know, TikTok, people get depressed because they're seeing people constantly portraying themselves as living the high life. And those people themselves who may be living the high life, there's this constant pressure to keep showing it. But many of those people don't actually feel it. So you can only fool yourself for so long, or fool other people, and eventually it all comes crashing down. And the disjuncture between your lack of happiness but your portrayal of superficial happiness, the clash is so much greater. When if you can find a way to be actively melancholic, I'd suggest, then you're actually on a more even keel, and it's mentally more healthy. But I've got no vested interest in saying that. But anyway, so I'm now going to give you examples of my propaganda effort on behalf of active melancholy in the style of Van Gogh. It took me a while to find a decent, and this isn't, I have a reproduction in a book, and I'm positive the original painting would be yet better, obviously. But there are other reproductions of this painting that don't convey, and this doesn't truly, the redness of the setting sun. And this reproduction's better than a lot I've seen, because on the left-hand side, a third halfway down, the redness of the leaves, it's almost the reflected light, the dying red, blood-like light of the sunset. Some reproductions don't capture that. And on the right-hand side, you can see a little bit of dying light as well. That, again, doesn't come out even in this reproduction as well as it could. It's a bit more obvious in a better reproduction. But this is what I mean by active, well, I'm using his phrase, I'm sorry for stealing it, but this notion of active melancholy. The way that figure is walking off into the sunset, framed by the trees that are largely denuded of foliage. The blood redness, the dying light, it's all incredibly melancholic, yet that's what makes it beautiful. In a way that much brighter light, much happier content, I just don't think achieves the same effect. Just can't. Now, I think I'm right in saying this is the same or similar. I don't think actually it is, but it's similar. It's similar to the previous cemetery tower you saw. But just the merging of the fields, the architecture of the tower, the trees by the tower, the way they merge with the darkness of the sky. The way the moon, I assume it's the moon, is coming out. There's a very slight symmetry with the white bonnet of the woman. And again, her clothing, you've got dark grey, then the white hat. Just as immediately in the background, you've got the darkness of what must be trees and the tower, and then you've got the greyness of the sky, and then you've got the white of the clouds and the moon. So it's just a beautifully symmetrical, again, actively melancholic, but no worse for that. And then this, I must confess, this is, of all the paintings I'm showing you in this talk, I think this is my favourite. And I'm not normally short of a word or two, but I don't think I could adequately put into words why I like this so much. And it's just a great example of Van Gogh's ability, this notion of active melancholy. Because I'm struggling to see how that's a particularly cheery painting, yet somehow it's just on the edge, that the subdued tones of the browns, but then the golden colour. The gold almost reminds me of, as a Klimt, in a completely different genre of painting, but it's such a beautiful gold colour. But that effulgence, or whatever word you'd want to use to describe the colour, the light coming off, it derives it all from the subdued nature of the brown. And the contrast, the way in which I'm assuming it's a river that's running through the middle, maybe a canal, but I'm guessing a river. But just the way he's portrayed the reflections of the darkness of the water and the reflected gold of the sky. I'm not sure this is a good example, but it just strikes me, in a superficial look at that painting is melancholic, but actually, if you're prepared to dive into the melancholy and do a bit of backstroke, it's actually it's not melancholic at all. So then another quote from the same letter. There's an old, often detestable, tyrannical academic school. Yeah, I could relate to that. The abomination of desolation. In fact, men having, so to speak, a suit of armour, a steel breastplate of prejudices and conventions. Those men, when they're in charge of things, have positions at their disposal, and by a system of circumlocution seek to support their protégés and to exclude the natural man from among them. This state of affairs has its bad side for someone who doesn't agree with all that, and who protests against it with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all the indignation of which he is capable. And I picked this out. I just think, he wasn't just good with a paintbrush. He could use words. Men having, so to speak, a suit of armour, a steel breastplate of prejudices and conventions. It's a brilliant summary of how certain ideological ways of thinking in our society have just become more and more baked in. You know, genuine discussion is just increasingly difficult. There's a certain dogmatism of people presupposing the nature of their own conclusions. I've just noticed it time after time after time, an increasing inability for people to genuinely question first principles, why and how they believe things. And instead, you tend to get tautological justifications, repetitious justifications for believing what people believe. And from Van Gogh's perspective, this is what he was fighting against. He was the stereotypical cliche of the artist starving in the garret. Because these people with the steel breastplate of prejudices and conventions, they're the people that run bureaucracy. They're the people that are the technocrats of our age. But I risk going off on one, so we will proceed. Someone has a great fire in his soul, and nobody ever comes to warm themselves at it. And passers-by see nothing but a little smoke at the top of the chimney, and then go on their way. So now, what are we to do? Keep this fire alive inside, have salt in ourselves, wait patiently. But with how much impatience? Await the hour, I say, when whoever wants to will come and sit down there, will stay there, for all I know. May whoever believes in God await the hour which will come sooner or later. Now this might strike you as a slightly odd little passage, but you'll see in a second why I've included it. Someone has a great fire in his soul and nobody ever comes to warm themselves at it, and passers-by see nothing but a little smoke. Why do I say little? Little. It sounds like the UK supermarket chain, Lidl. A little smoke at the top of the chimney and then go on their way. So he's obviously describing how, people don't see the inner depths of other people. And in this notion of keep this fire alive inside. But I wanted you to see this because this goes to my point that I made before about when you know some of the thoughts Van Gogh was having, and then you see some of his paintings that illustrate or just resonate with these type of comments, it just adds a fascinating extra dimension. So just to show you. So if you think of that previous quote, keep it in mind, and then this idea of the lonely cottage. And again, there's just the autumnal lighting quality that I absolutely think is brilliant. But then also, if you've seen the video I did on Hitchcock's Rear Window and the cigar of Thorwald the murderer looking back at Scotty the protagonist, this just reminds me of it. This little detail that I'm assuming is a fire inside. That it's the hearth of this otherwise dark and quite dingy cottage. And just a by-the-by observation, the colouring in the clouds in the left, and you see the same hints of colour in vegetation on the right-hand side, just as the eave of the cottage points at it almost like a finger. And then, to a lesser extent, also the blue of the peasant woman's dress. It looks like it's seen better days, but there's enough blue left in it to bring out some of the colour in the sky. And then in the far left, if I can... you can see the colouring both on the side of the cottage and in the foliage on the left. And just again, the beautiful gold colour in the sky, which I don't think I noticed fully when I first saw the painting as a whole. But the way in which the reddish foliage and the slightly reddish side of the cottage complement that single bit of red right in the middle, the hearth, I'm assuming, of the cottage. And I was really keen to show you this just because the next painting is also, plot spoiler, is also of a cottage or cottages, but it's much more identifiably Van Gogh, whereas this is quite early on. Actually, not particularly early, but it's not the style, let's put it this way, it's not the style most people associate with Van Gogh, this type of painting. Which is why it just underscores the idea that it's a mistake to pigeonhole artists. He's much more famous for the intense colour, whereas this is much more subtle. But again, if you think back to the comment about passing a cottage with smoke coming out the chimney, and this is, much more all the subtlety of the reds I was talking about in the previous painting. There's little subtlety here. That's not a criticism. This is much more intense and passionate, to quote from his notion of passion. And then there's another, I'm about to show you one more cottage themed painting, which I don't think it's now known. You see here Van Gogh's referring to it as the entrance to a quarry. Excuse me. I rather like the entrance to a quarry. I was doing it when I felt this attack coming on, because to my mind the sombre greens go well with the ochre tones. There is something sad in it which is healthy, and that is why it does not bore me. Perhaps that is true of the mountain too. They tell me that mountains are not like that, and that there are black outlines of a finger's width. But after all, it seemed to me it expressed the passage in Rod's book about a desolate country of sombre mountains, among which are some dark goatherds' huts where sunflowers are blooming. So there was an Edouard Rod, Le Son de la Vie, The Sense of Life. He's referring to a particular book. But this is to illustrate this quotation. This is the reference to the mountain. And I'm so thick. It actually took me a while to realise that's where the cottage was. Initially, it just passed me by. I was so intent on looking at the shape of the mountain. So, another quote from the letter: everything in men and in their works that is truly good and beautiful, with an inner moral, spiritual, and sublime beauty, I think that comes from God, and that everything that is bad and wicked in the works of men and in men that's not from God, and God doesn't find it good either. But without intending it, I'm always inclined to believe that the best way of knowing God is to love a great deal. Love that friend, that person, that thing, whatever you like. You'll be on the right path to knowing more thoroughly afterwards. That's what I say to myself. But you must love with a high, serious, intimate sympathy, with a will, with intelligence, and you must always seek to know more, thoroughly, better, and more. That leads to God, that leads to unshakable faith. Someone, to give an example, will love Rembrandt, but seriously, that man will know there is a God. He'll believe firmly in him. Someone will make a deep study of the history of the French Revolution. He will not be an unbeliever. He will see that in great things too, there is a sovereign power that manifests itself. And I won't go into huge loads of depth on this, but it's almost pantheistic in the sense that you don't have to. He's talking about belief in God, but then towards the end he talks about there is a sovereign power that manifests itself. So in future talks I'll probably develop the idea. I've mentioned Schopenhauer, which I want to talk about, the idea of the world as will and representation, this idea of there's an underlying life force that Schopenhauer calls will, but it's almost like Van Gogh here is talking about there is a sovereign power that manifests itself. The ancient Greeks had the concept of logos, which ironically we take the modern notion of logic from, but it was a much more layered, nuanced notion, logos. It meant the underlying pattern to life rather than just sheer simple logic, which is the contemporary. We've evacuated, we've eviscerated. It's an enervated term we use logic in today, whereas the Greeks had a much fuller notion, logos. But anyway, that's more talks to come. Quite complex ideas. Well, not even complex, but there's a depth of references and detail to go into. But this Van Gogh's back to this notion of passion almost, this high, serious, intimate sympathy with a will, with intelligence. And you must always seek to know more. So it's the intensity of feeling that Van Gogh is promoting, but not just simple intensity, this idea with a will, with intelligence, serious, intimate sympathy. And again, to bang on the same old point, but if his previous points about reading, the importance of reading, the importance of art, linked to passion, this is what he's claiming gives life a sense of, some sense that there's a sovereign power that manifests itself, whether you choose to believe of that as a god or some underlying life force. But I'm showing this quotation because this, for me, shows Van Gogh's notion of what gives life meaning through art and learning and passion for art and learning. And yet again, it's what was signally lacking in these days. And he's mentioned Rembrandt a few times. This is The Raising of Lazarus by Rembrandt. And I thought it would be interesting to directly compare it with Van Gogh's portrayal of this same concept. So he painted after Rembrandt, so to speak. Just to contrast the, there's a hint of radiance. It's quite typically Rembrandt. It's dark, it's morose, but there is, yellow light to the left. And then the way Van Gogh just takes a completely different approach, even though it's the same basic theme that he's addressing. And I'm just interested with, if you, in the absence of knowledge of Van Gogh's appreciation and that this was there was a direct influence of Rembrandt on him, you'd be struggling to see the link between the two paintings, I'd suggest. Which, I don't know, if it just goes to show the difficulty of sometimes seeing how influence works out in an artist's mind. Sorry, there's a missing bracket. There should be one before the word after. There's always one typo, even though I try and check as diligently as I can. I always miss one. And then just getting towards the end now. But an idle man that resembles an idle bird, and it's often impossible for men to do anything. Prisoners in I don't know what kind of horrible, horrible, very horrible cage. There is also, I know, release, belated release, a reputation ruined rightly or wrongly, poverty, inevitability of circumstances, misfortune that creates prisoners. You may not always be able to say what it is that confines, that immures, that seems to bury, and yet you feel I know not what bars, I know not what gates, walls. Is all that imaginary, a fantasy? I don't think so. And then you ask yourself, dear God, is this for long? Is this forever? Is this for eternity? But if it became possible for you to see in me something other than an idler of the bad kind, I would be very pleased about that. So this is the poignancy of Van Gogh writing to his brother, just asking him to think more of him, because of his time, his life was largely a complete and utter failure. He requires constant support from his brother and his family. He's alienated himself from his father. He had an odd relationship with a woman who'd previously been a prostitute and had 2 children, and he chose to pursue his art, and he left her. I think she then subsequently committed suicide. So it's a horrible, horrible personal life. But this notion of, again, back to the image of a bird, trapped in a cage this time. So just to emphasise this, you may not always be able to say what it is the confines that immures, that seems to bury, and yet you feel I know not what bars, I know not what gates, walls. So this repetition of walls, and then there's this brilliant painting he does that illustrates this plaintive, plangent dirge about the inevitability of circumstances, misfortune that creates prisoners. I just think I wanted to show you the words he uses in order then, when you see the painting, that's what reading Van Gogh's letters adds. Just it is. I just do think it's worthwhile looking at the letters and the paintings together. But this is the Gustave Doré. This is the paint. Sorry, this is the ink drawing that influenced the next painting I'm going to show you from Van Gogh himself. I showed you examples of Gustave Doré with reference to Dante previously. He's stunning, given that it's just, you know, black and white or ink. And there's just the details on the face. Both, if you look right at the back wall, the face looking at you from the back wall, and then in the foreground walking towards us. And even to the left, sorry, to the right, just above the hat of the second guard from the right, you can see the face poking out, its head almost against the wall, looking at us. Almost ghost-like, wraith-like faces. You know, quite poignant, the dehumanization, the spectral lack of humanity in these figures that have been reduced to walking round and around and around a prison yard. And this is one of the highlights of their day. But this was Van Gogh's version of that. Just to show you the similar faces. I don't know how much you want to make of it, but if you notice, there's 3 prison guards or figures on the right. I think the previous one there was just 2. Just double check, yeah. Actually, no, it might be. Yeah, you can just see the third. It's not very obvious in the Doré. But if you notice the third from the right, the prison guard, you can't, I think his face is in shadow the way Van Gogh has presented it. So it's the facelessness of the people in power. It's just interesting in this rather than the Doré, there's light coming in from the top, which doesn't provide any relief because it just reminds you that these prisoners aren't out doors in the sense they're not free to enjoy the light. They're in this dingy courtyard, and the light almost underlines what they haven't got access to anymore. Now, the final quotation, and I'll just finish with one of the most evocative paintings I think Van Gogh ever produced. So again, this concept of a bird in a cage. In the springtime, a bird in a cage knows very well that there's something he'd be good for. He feels very clearly that there's something to be done, but he can't do it. What it is, he can't clearly remember, and he has vague ideas and says to himself, the others are building their nests and making their little ones and raising the brood. And he bangs his head against the bars of his cage, and then the cage stays there, and the bird is mad with suffering. Look, there's an idler, says another passing bird. That fellow's a sort of man of leisure, and yet the prisoner lives and doesn't die. Nothing of what's going on within shows outside. He's in good health. He's rather cheerful in the sunshine. But then comes the season of migration, a bout of melancholy. But say the children who look after him, he's got everything that he needs in his cage, after all, but he looks at the sky outside, heavy with storm clouds, and within himself feels a rebellion against fate. I'm in a cage, and so I lack for nothing, you fools. Me, I have everything I need. Ah, for pity's sake, freedom, to be a bird like other birds. So again, the poignancy of, obviously, this is how trapped Van Gogh felt inside his own head. So like the cottage with the smoke coming out the chimney, people don't know what's inside, the little fire inside. But this bit I've emphasised, emboldened and italicised, but he looks at the sky outside, heavy with storm clouds, and within himself feels rebellion against fate. Ah, for pity's sake, freedom to be a bird like other birds. So if you can keep those ideas, particularly the idea of the sky outside heavy with storm clouds and the birds, and within himself feels a rebellion against fate. And then I think the following painting is a beautiful representation of some of the sensibility in that quotation. So I'll finish with that, and until next time, all the very best. Take care.